Welcome. This is the second of today's third of today's Radical History Zone as part of the Anarchist Bookfair. My name's Di Parkin and I'm a member of the Bristol Radical History Group. And I wonder if are people looking like they're about to come in or no?
Shut the door.
Shut the door.
I'll go to some cardboard in there.
So, I'd like to introduce Steve Hunt, who's giving this talk, which is called
Revolutionary. Well, I've called it the book is called The Revolutionary Urbanism of Street Farm, but I've called it Eco-anarchism of Street Farm today because a lot of what I'm talking about is eco-anarchism, and obviously that fits in quite well with the topic of the Bristol Anarchist Bookfair.
Okay, Steve's a long-time member of the Bristol Radical History Group, author of Anarchism in the Southwest. Any other major works?
Gone. So yesterday's tomorrow. Gone suburbs. You might have come across one of the other little ones in the. Where are they? Yeah. Over on the spinner over there. One of the Bristol Radical History Group pamphlets.
So he's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions before everybody pours in for the next session. Over to you, Steve.
Lovely. Thanks. Okay, just before we get started, apart from my nearest and dearest comrades who've been banging on about this, who's heard of Street Farm or the Street Farm Collective before? Okay, I was just wondering if you had and what there might be. Yeah, half of them. Somebody's not too sure. So, okay, so, right, we'll assume nothing. So, yeah, so I've spent quite a bit of time writing actually what was one of the small Bristol Radical History pamphlets about Street Farm, and something it all went horribly wrong and spiralled into a whole book because I got so fascinated with these guys and I thought they really had something interesting to say, and they were doing some really interesting stuff in the early 1970s. So can I have the first slide, please? Yeah. So, who or what was Street Farm? I mean, the first very quick answer is it was Graham, Caine, Peter Crump, and Bruce Haggart. So, if we just call them a group of a small radical architects collective for the time being, kind of bracket that out. They're all around in the early 1970s is when they were active under that name. They do have Bristol connections as well. So, Peter Crump is still here in Bristol. In fact, he gave the first ever talk for the Radical History Zone 3 years ago, and he would have come. He's got something else on today. He said he was going to come along and bring some searching and difficult questions for us. So he's still here. Graham Caine lived in Bristol for probably 15 or 20 years, so very much involved in Bristol. Talk about some of his Bristolian projects at the end. If you haven't heard of Street Farm, you may have heard of the Bristol Gnomes. Graham was very much involved with the Bristol Gnomes a little bit later. So there's a lot of Bristol connections. I kept coming across these groups. I mean, obviously with my kind of interests, if there's anything about anarchism or the counterculture or ecology, my ears tend to prick up and I get very interested. And I kept coming across Street Farm. There's a book by that Derek Wall wrote quite a few years ago now about the roads movement and Earth First. And I was involved. I was one of them. I knew Derek quite well, and he interviewed me for that, and I was kind of reading that, and there was lots of stuff about the street farmers in there, so that's one of the first times that I came across them, and I thought they sounded fascinating, and we thought those of us who were involved in road protests in the late 90s and Reclaim the Streets and those sorts of things, thought we were being pioneering. These guys had done Reclaim the Streets type actions 30 years earlier in London. They'd shut down traffic and things like that, so very much at the cutting edge of early political ecology movement, which I was interested in. They appear, that's one aspect of them, is the political side. They appear quite often in books about green architecture, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is the first ecological house, which I think is, if they got one claim to fame, that seems to be quite important. Reason why we should have heard of the Street Farm Collective today. I'd absolutely say it was the first ecological house, and there's a few issues around that which we'll talk about a little bit later. So one of the other things they did was a magazine called Street Farmer, and I can show you a little bit what the street farmer looked like. So they did a couple of issues of kind of an underground magazine called The Street Farmer, which again I think is absolutely fascinating. I got Peter Crump entrusted me with electronic copies of that, and that was one of the reasons I was completely hooked into the project we were carrying out. So somebody else who knew them at the time was a guy called Peter Harper, who's one of the people behind the Centre for Alternative Technology. In fact, he's the person who coined the term alternative technology, as an aside, and he described them in the early 1970s as green anarchists who do urban guerrilla architecture that almost work and are very funny. So there's a lot of facets to them which I thought was interesting. So okay, I sort of heard about them, I knew that they were doing this interesting stuff, but I had a bit of a problem because they were around kind of 30 or 40 years earlier. I felt a bit like, I don't know if you've seen that film Searching for Sugar Man. I had these kind of early 70s characters, didn't really know how I would track them down, if they were around. Luckily there was a little bit of, well, the internet does wonderful things, a little bit of serendipity as well. I kind of knew that they were connected to the Bristol Gnomes, so originally, straight away that brings us closer to us in Bristol. And I also remembered that some of us were involved with an anarchist magazine called Bristol Magazine, which a few old timers here may remember, may have been involved with in one or two cases. When we were doing doing Bristol Magazine, there was quite a lot of stuff in there about the suburbs development, and I remembered that the Gnomes were involved with that. So when I managed to track down Caine on the internet, I realised he was the right Bristol Gnome, or the right street farm member, and also we had a little bit of connection previously, so I could say, well, we were involved with this campaign. So that was quite useful. Otherwise, why the hell would we want to speak to be pestered by a history researcher from the history group years later? So anyway, cut a long story short, obviously I got hold of him because the book is here today. He actually left the country and is living over in Spain these days, but he comes back from time to time. He was very happy to meet up and talk about Street Farm, which was fantastic. So we met up for a pint or two or three, some structured interviews in the farmhouse and the stillage and the White Hart and various places. And at that point I was thinking, oh, actually there's a really interesting, they've got a really interesting story to tell about the early political ecology movement of the early 1970s, which I think is enormously sort of important in terms of a lot of things probably that are going on at the Anarchist Bookfair today, in terms of the issues that we're confronting, things like anything from the anti-fracking campaign and the anti-nuclear stuff. Very much the political ecology movement of the early 1970s is the foundation of a lot of the stuff that's going on today. So that was fantastic, very, very lovely guy, very, very helpful. But he said, actually, you want to speak to Peter Crump. So he's a born anarchist, he's got a fantastic archive, and he still lives in Bristol. And I can remember his personal phone number off the top of my head, so I have a word with Peter Crump. So I got in touch with him. Again, he was brilliant, very, very helpful, sharing a lot. He's actually got the archive of a lot of the street farm stuff, so it's not easy to get hold of these days. So he was another one of the original editors of Street Farmer magazine. As I say, he came along to the first ever Radical History Zone that we ran when it was back in the Hamilton House, and gave a talk there. It was absolutely fascinating and shared his information. So they were very, very generous in sort of very, very excited that I was interested in them, and they had lots and lots of stories. So that was brilliant. So yeah, that's a little, they did this thing called revolutionary urbanism, so there's a little snippet there, you probably can't read that from there, but there's a little bit to prove that they don't have anarchism written all over their stuff, and you don't see the circle A, you don't really see that image used in the early 70s very much. I think I'm right in saying it was a French group called the Jeunesse Libertaire, used some of the other anarchist historians may bear me out on this, but I think that image came along a bit later, and they used that in the early 1970s. It took a while to kind of filter through to the London scene, but there's little quotes, unattributed quotes there from Bakunin. We have a new world in here in our hearts, a world that is growing from Giuritti, Buenaventura Giuritti there. I think we've got the urge to destroy as a creative passion in there somewhere from Bakunin. So they were referencing lots of anarchist history at that time as well. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. Yeah, okay, so so different ways to approach them. So they're an affinity group, a collective, they call themselves. They said they spent a lot of time talking about, they call themselves Street Farm, although we know them individually as street farmers, but they said, Pete said something like, you never believe how many committee meetings we had to decide to call ourselves Street Farm. So that is technically what they like to be called. So I said there's different ways of approaching them. First of all, I talked about the alternative media, so probably public face of Street Farm was this magazine which they put together. There were two kind of classic issues of that, so quite important in terms of media history. They were very much sort of the height of the counterculture in the early 1970s. They were putting these magazines out. They were very politically involved, so even before the Street Farmer magazine came out, they were very influenced by the like the 1968 events in Paris. So they were coming from that new left trajectory, but they were very much on the libertarian side of that. Peter Crump had met somebody called Alan Elben, who was involved with Freedom Magazine and Green Anarchist, wrote on land issues, was behind the squatters movement and I think the early city farmers movement, so very much involved in the green side of anarchism. So that was somebody that Peter Crump sort of met fairly on. I think he was probably quite influential on the direction it took afterwards. So both of them were involved in the Committee of 100, which was the direct action wing of the peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement in the late 50s, early 60s. So it came very much from a political background. They were all involved with it. We were talking about the first session today. Dean was talking about Wally Hope being involved with the anti-Vietnam movement. Anybody involved with the New Left in that stage would have been involved in the anti-Vietnam protests. So they're very much coming from that direction. They were architects, so they first met through the Architecture Association, and when they became involved with that, they'd already been out in the real world, if you like, working as practicing architects. So they joined a bit later in life, but I think they were kind of gobbled up by the Architecture Association because they were people who'd really done a lot of drafting and been involved in real world projects and things. So they got to know each other. They sort of realised they were all kindred political spirits. At the Architecture Centre, so the Architecture Association in Bedford Square at that time. In terms of the most important contribution, I think, with the architecture is the ecological house called Street Farm House, which they constructed in the early 1970s. And I can show you a couple of images of Street Farm House, the ecological house, a bit later. After Graham in particular spearheaded the kind of practical side of Street Farm, he went on to, in the early 1974 or 75, he went out to Portugal and was involved with the Portuguese Revolution. So he went out in a very practical sense with a van of other people, they're called street farmers, and helped them set up solar showers and a kind of alternative infrastructure. So he's got a lot of fascinating stories to tell about that era. They're also involved in the mid-1970s. There was a thing called the Comtech Festival over in Bath, and that was really the kind of national festival for alternative technology at that time, which ran for several years. And they were really key people behind setting up some of the infrastructure and some of the media input into that event. So that was their architecture side. In the end, they didn't really start off as, they started off as kind of situationist, new left politicos, but they became to see the environment as a really absolutely crucial part of that movement. So they saw environmental degradation as endemic to capitalism, so they're an anti-capitalist group. And so they took on other influences like the social ecology of Murray Bookchin. So you've got this whole different way of approaching this group. They're quite difficult to pin down in terms of what they were up to, but they're putting a lot of information out. We could move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of, first of all, so they were doing radical media. So I picked a nice selection of late 60s, early 70s papers. There's nothing I like better than kind of foraging around these old underground press papers. So probably the most famous parts of the underground press would have been Oz Magazine, infamous almost, International Times, which still has an online presence, but very, very key to the counterculture in the late 60s. Gandalf's Garden, sort of the Flower Child publication, beautifully designed. For the anarchist movement, you've got Anarchy magazine, Colin Ward's magazine, which ran right the way through from the 60s to about 1970. So again, fantastic standards of design and research went into that magazine. So there's a real high point of countercultural and the underground press. More on the architecture side of things, you've got the Undercurrents magazine, which eventually I think filtered into Resurgent. So again, gorgeous covers that they were doing. They were pioneering anything around alternative technology and the DIY movement, and very optimistic, very utopian, but very practically grounded groups as well. So that was very much where they were coming from. Put Mother Earth News in there. That was an American publication that actually had a very early interview with Graham Caine about the ecological house. That's still going today. And on the other side, there's this thing called ARSE. That stood for Architects for a Really Socialist Architects for a Really Socialist Environment. The AR is in capitals, is a bit of a Mooney at the Architecture Review, which was far more establishment, mainstream architecture magazine. But they also said ARCSE could stand for whatever you fancied. That could be it. So that's a nice kind of snapshot of the kind of underground press of the times that they were coming from. Could I have the next slide, please? So Street Farmer magazine itself came out from that time. So that's the two covers of the two issues of Street Farm that were produced. Very time-consuming to produce radical literature in those days, because they obviously didn't have the internet, they didn't have laser printers, they didn't have posh graphic design software and all those sorts of things. So, I mean, even I can remember sort of hauling around. We had a massive big Gestetner machine over in Bath that we moved at least 4 times doing our backs in to try and produce some really probably illegible literature on those sorts of things at the time. So they only produced 2 issues, but that was quite a feat. They had to produce all the artwork. Peter's Crump still got these great big paste boards of all the original collages and things, which were really fairly huge, and then they would haul them off to the local printers to get them done. So quite a lot of work went involved, and also a lot of people involved with these as well. The 3 of them were the main editors, but certainly by Street Farmer 2, it's quite eclectic kind of collage of different ideas, just mates that they knew, other comrades, partners are all chipping in with this stuff. So a really interesting mixture and a really good snapshot of some of the politics of the time. So again, sort of within the underground press, there were a lot of magazines that were specifically around architecture and planning, environmental issues, and it was a part of that. So the Street Farmer magazine was something they did. They produced, I think, sort of 700 issues or so. So they got those out. But the other thing they did is they had this idea themselves as rock and roll architects. So they should be rock and roll musicians. Why not rock and roll architects? So they got in a van and they drove around. I think they went to every school of architecture in the country and they spoke to the students there. They even went into 1 or 2 schools or invited them in for the sorts of things they were doing. So what they do, they set up a slideshow, they put a rock and roll backdrop to it, so Hawkwind and Jefferson Airplane and Pink Fairies, who were mates of theirs anyway, and Frank Zappa. They put all this stuff on and they tour this stuff, have a few parties along the way. They got as far as, I mean, they actually did talks in France, they did talks in the Netherlands, they took part in a festival, sort of avant-garde festival over in Italy. So they put a lot of work into sort of community outreach at the time. There was no point in producing this stuff, nobody knows we're doing it and nobody hears about it. So that was a big part of what they did. The other side of the media that they were doing is they actually produced, there's 2 documentaries about them. So one, there was a project called Open Door, which the BBC did at the time. There was no way they would do this these days probably. They would hand over the camera crew to a local grassroots controversial group, anarchist group. They'd say, go off and make a documentary and we'll put it on national TV for you, which is what they did in those days. So I think they made, I think there's probably about 10 open doors, and then they carried on with a thing called Open Space a bit later. So quite innovative, quite daring television they were involved in. Street Farm got to do one of these slots through that. So they were getting quite a lot of coverage at the time. They also did there was another documentary about them, which was undertaken by a very youthful Melvin Bragg. So he went along and interviewed them, and he was the presenter for this programme. But again, that also gave them a platform for their ideas, and in the film there's a lot of opportunity for them to express, not only describe the architectural projects that are involved with, but actually express the politics behind that, which was interesting. Go to the next slide, please. So they came up with this thing called what they called revolutionary urbanism, which was basically a kind of variant of anarchism, very much influenced by the Situationists. So I've described it at one point as Monty Python meets the Situationists in terms of the kind of collages they were doing. And that's not just a throwaway connection, there were real connections with both of those things. As I mentioned, they were very much involved with the 1968 events. Raoul Vanagon, one of the Belgian Situationists, was a bit of a hero of theirs. So when Peter Crump spoke 3 or 4 years ago, he said, he quoted Vanagon, he said, "The moment of revolution must bring about an improvement in life for everyone, not just for the suppressed and the poor and the needy, but to everyone, because actually nobody's happy under the present capitalist system." So a lot of their stuff is a kind of application of Situationist ideas in particular. They also, bringing in the Monty Python side of things, they actually met Terry Gilliam, who lived in North London at the time. They met him. He gave them a few tips on doing collages. He said, "Oh, don't bother with scissors, just tear it out. Everybody knows it's an illusion anyway." And slap these different collages together. So very interesting cartoon art that they've come up with. The other thing that, in terms of their politics, I think Peter Crump again put this in a nutshell. He described the ethos behind Street Farm, Street Farmer magazine. He said the ideas behind Street Farmer magazine were modest. Basically, we wanted to have a world revolution, we wanted to get rid of the state, and we wanted to live in an anarchist utopia. So that was where they were coming from. Difficult to pin down in some ways, because they were very much against having a dogmatic blueprint. They're coming from a libertarian perspective, so they didn't want to set out a manifesto or a blueprint of what we needed to do. What they described it as was setting up a kind of toolkit of different ideas that people could go away and develop for themselves. So very much coming from this libertarian perspective. So might sound a little bit sketchy so far, so let's look in a bit more detail about some of the things they were talking about. The next one. Alienation is probably not used as much in political discussion these days, but very, very kind of important political term of critique, I think, of capitalism, I suppose, in critiquing capitalism, which was very much something that was talked about at that time. So think about it, they were first getting together in the late 1960s, 1968, for example. So I don't remember much about 1968. I was in a nappy in 1968, but there'd been no war for 20 years in terms of the probably colonial wars going on, but certainly nothing that sort of hit Britain on the home front. National service had finally been done away by then. We had a situation where real wages had been rising for some time. Consumerism was around. They were actually talking about a thing called post-scarcity. So never mind talking about austerity today. That was seen that the problems of production have been solved by that time. So there was all that going on. There was really good opportunities for a lot of working class people going to university for the first time, and there were a lot of fantastic parties going on, which is all good. And then in the future, well, you could be they're talking about we'd all be getting robots to do our work. It was taken as read that people would be doing a 3-day week very soon. And then beyond that, we'd be having tourist visits to the moon, so we'd be wearing shiny suits. It's a very, very optimistic time. So you might think, well, why was there a big, powerful movement of revolt at that time? And then, so there was uprisings in Paris and but obviously in other cities, London, Berlin at the time. So then the Situationists came along, kind of spoiled it for everybody in some ways, really, in terms of of things like consumerism. So they were kind of you could call it a kind of a hybrid of libertarianism and Marxism, which they brought to play. And they talked about these ideas like alienation, and if everything was going so well, then why were people so bloody miserable, and why was life so depressing, and why were we talking about apocalypse at the same time? So there was a bit of a quandary there. And alienation was very much a part of that, talking about, well, we might have a lot more consumer goods, and we might be a bit more affluent, but actually in terms of the conditions of our daily life, we still have very little control over our waking hours. If we're in the workplace, we might talk about democracy, but we have an X every 5 years in political terms, but we wouldn't have any real control over the production processes in most cases, so that would still be decided by the boss. The sorts of things we produce would be for other people's profit, and the surplus value would be for other people's profit. In terms of whether it was socially useful or whether it was aesthetically pleasing, whether it had any kind of moral or environmental impact was completely irrelevant in terms of our power in the workplace. So, so therefore they used the Marxist idea about the division of labour and about us having very little control as individuals over the products that we were producing. So that was important. So they talked about this idea about estrangement. So we'd have little impact, mostly in terms of the political process, very much as today. Decisions will be made in the boardrooms, or they'll be made in Westminster. We have little control over that. And the Situationists probably one of the first people who really attacked consumerism, and thought about they talked about, if anybody's heard anything about Situationists, probably the idea about the society of the spectacle, the idea that we very much we live through other people's experiences. We produce things for the rich, and we live for the rich and for celebrities. So they're very, very critical of that, and they use that as an explanation of why there is still so much discontent. This could be applied further to the natural world as well. So there was a feeling that we'd become industrialism under capitalism, it estranges us further and further from the things that we use in our daily life and our access to and our experience of the natural world. So people like Theodore Roszak, who was one of the people that coined the term, this person coined the term counterculture, was an American but spent a lot of time in Paris during the sort of revolutionary days of 1968, and he started to question, even if those revolutions were successful and we attained workers' power and control over the means of production, we still need to think about the impact on the natural world. And for him, that didn't really go far enough. We were producing cars that were destroying life in the cities. Then we needed to be even more critical about the stances that we took. The positive side of the Situationists International is they had this idea about life being a permanent game. So all the divisions that we had between work and play, and leisure in the workplace, and the countryside and the city, they had this idea called unitary urbanism, which meant that everything would be much more seamlessly coordinated. We would have more control over our lives, and we would enjoy life through our creative endeavours. We would no longer be sort of beaten down by this treadmill of work for the wealthy. So this was a time of very, very radical experimentation in terms of what was going on in the New Left. I like the example. There was an example of a squat in Berlin, for example, where all the people on the squat decided that they would get rid of doors between their rooms because of the violence and the crimes of the previous generation. They were going to live their life in transparency and honesty, so they took all the doors came off the rooms, and they tried to live experimentally in that way. So some very, very radical experimentation going on at the time. Have the next slide, please. So we would call this probably social revolution, so not just a political revolution when you went out and you changed the government or you argued for a little bit more distribution of wealth. They had this term, and they call it transmogrification, or we could call it metamorphosis. There would be a complete redefinition of our experience of everyday life. So they were talking about real grassroots control. They were talking about things like direct democracy. So they weren't just they weren't sort of marching in Trafalgar Square necessarily. They were engaging in actions which they thought would really transform the conditions of everyday life. So they're very, very utopian and aspirational. because I hope to show they were very practical in the sorts of measures that they thought might help with that as well. So I'll move on a little bit. So yeah, they worked mostly on the art. They were very interested in urban architecture, and they had a feeling that as architects, they didn't want to be complicit in the way that architects were seen, and planners were seen as part of the mechanism of social control and state control of our everyday life. So they didn't want any of that. So they're very much opposed to things like massive tower blocks that were imposed on people. Tower blocks don't get a good look in Street Farmer magazines at all. If you see a tower block, it's being dissolved by an aerosol. Women are pleasuring themselves on tower blocks. There's seeds being dropped which breaks the tower block apart. There's trees sprouting out of tower blocks. So that kind of exemplified everything that was wrong by the way that people were excluded from decision making about their everyday life, and particularly about not necessarily the form of the tower block, that was something they didn't like, but also the issues of control and the way that represented capital control over individuals was very important to them. And it's quite interesting in terms of, I don't know if you noticed the news about the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, and I think they're going to ceremonially blow up 5 tower blocks as a way of introducing that. So these politics go back quite a long way. What I'd like to do actually, to show you where they were coming from in terms of their politics, is just show a quick clip of Graham Caine. I think I've got it in the right place, Billy. It's on the, it's not on the PowerPoint. It's on another little. There he is. So Graham Caine, street farmer extraordinaire. There he goes. Okay. No sound. Well, we might need to. Why is that? Yeah, is that not going to? No, we.
Through the first year, I was at the Architecture Association studying. We threw out the chairman. I mean, it was a very radical time. A time when you just found so many people who had similar ideas about what liberation would be, what liberated technology would be, green politics.
A strange building among the suburban terraces of Elton in South London. Street farm. An attempt to live closer to nature without dropping out to the country and abandoning the city. A way to undermine the increasingly rigid and regimented life offered in our towns. Graham Caine, who lives here part-time with his wife and child, and Bruce Haggart, were members of a group of architectural students, the Street Farmers, that tried to build on land lent by Thames Polytechnic, a home in which to live as self-sufficiently as possible.
We lived there for 3 years, and we had a good time. We set out to do all sorts of experiments. All this data was sort of coming out each week. I used to collect it and stuff, but we kind of moved away from the slightly serious research into a very political process of going lecturing. We set up lectures at virtually every school of architecture in England. It was also a time when architects were probably at their most ruthless. They were putting up some of the worst buildings that probably the history of architecture has witnessed. They were chucking up these tower blocks, and people were saying, we don't want to live like this, we don't want this. And architects were saying, oh, but it'd be lovely, or just the job, it's exactly what you want. And they were so arrogant. Architects, it has put me off architecture for life, that it's against that kind of background that we built this little house there. So 25 years on, this is the Create Eco hat.
Yeah, there we go. He's in. That's obviously Create in Bristol. So yeah, really. This was a bit of a later documentary that Graham was involved with, called "Travels with My Chainsaw." which might be called. So yeah, I was talking about this total transformation of the city. So the city that they envisaged would even sound and smell differently, because they'd be trying to get rid of cars. They've been very into organic architecture. So a complete transformation of the conditions of everyday life. The other thing they were very keen on was this idea of dweller control. So communities would decide on the architecture that they wanted, and they would be very much participants in the design and the creation of the structures that were built, which was very important to them. So what happened at the time with people like Tom Woolley, who was involved with the Arse magazine, which I mentioned earlier, they set up these things called community technical aid centres in the 70s, so to empower neighbourhoods to be able to have that sort of control over their architecture and over the conditions of their local communities. So way above a lot of the stuff that's attempted in these days in some ways. The other person I mentioned is Murray Bookchin, the social ecologist, was very influential. So he talked about this thing called libertarian municipalism. Again, the idea that people would decide on the conditions of their local communities in face-to-face assemblies, and then obviously it wouldn't be practical to decide, make all the micro decisions in that way, so all the policy would be decided at the neighbourhood level, and then it would be mandated to delegates who would federate and they'd make these decisions across the city, across the region, internationally hopefully eventually. So they had an idea for an alternative political structure which they were trying to put forward. I guess I want to move on a bit now. So shall I move on to, I think what I'll do, that gives you quite an idea where they were coming from. Perhaps if we could just skip a couple of slides. So yeah, autonomy is an idea that's already come up today. So political ecology was very important to them. I like that slide because it shows that the political ecology movement was very much one of the new social movements that was part of a wider radicalism and counterculture at that time. And I think probably the Black Power movement that came out of the civil rights movement was very, very important in kind of radicalising people, and that was one of the first of those new social movements in many ways. Student power was very important, and there were big upheavals at the architecture centre at the moment, which the street farmers were involved with, which was very, very interesting. And I love this image here of the clenched fist tree for the ecology movement as well, so they've kind of adapted that for their political purposes, which I think is fantastic. They had some wonderful slogans as well. Up against the hedge, Mother Earth fuckers was one of their slogans. The land belongs to communities of the biosphere, not individuals of the human race. So the political ecology of the 1970s thought about a global threat to the environment, which was something that was quite new about it, which I think is interesting. And also the value of other species and habitats in their own right, not just for what they could do for humanity, was very important. Okay, let's whiz on. What I must do then is show you the ecological house. So we could move on to the next. Let's see an image of the ecological house. I've been talking about that quite a lot. So they've got all this kind of hodgepodge of ideas from situationism, anti-capitalism, a little bit of Kurt Vonnegut and Monty Python thrown in. So these sort of influences from pop culture all mixed in together. So it was all sounding like a bit of a hodgepodge. What they did in practice was they started to create this alternative architecture. So this is the ecological house. Now, probably first of all you're going to say, well, it's a bit brazen to call it the first ecological house. Haven't people been living in biodegradable homes in tribes for millennia? So that's one thing you might say about it. In another sense, there were people tinkering with this technology beforehand. So particularly somebody called Peter Mandressa had been, even before the Second World War, he'd been experimenting with solar panels and with wind turbines. So the technology wasn't new to Street Farm. And then the other thing is, I suppose, if you look at cutting edge green architecture now, that looks quite primitive in some ways. It's basically a cabin with this is actually plastic rather than glass greenhouse next to it. So you might be thinking, well, is this a bit of a big claim about the ecological house? I think in other senses it does have some quite strong claims. First of all, Graham Caine called it the Ecological House in 1971. So as far as I can see, he seems to be ahead of the game in terms of making that claim, when he was intentionally designing a house to be ecological. And by that he meant it was an autonomous house. So it was the idea was it would be independent of the service structure of the state, and it wouldn't rely upon utilities, private utility companies. In those days anyway, but it would be able to produce its own power internally, which I think was important. So he used that name. There were one or two other contenders, as I say, into the mid-1970s, but this was this seems to be one of the first models, and it was accepted as an important event at the time as well. It got national. It was on the front page of the Observer. The BBC turned up. It featured in the Melvyn Bragg documentary that I talked about earlier, and they were almost overwhelmed by actually international attention to this building here. It was even raised in the House of Lords in a discussion about the environment in the House of Lords. Graham Caine was cited as an exemplar of coming up with the first ecological house. So a lot of people were turning up at the door. So that was important. The other thing I was talking about was, I mentioned Murray Bookchin again. They were talking about not only the technical innovations in terms of clever kit like solar panels and wind turbines, but it was a political expression that was important to them. So covered in there's things like workers' power, covered in political slogans. There's a political ecology flag flying there as well, so that was there. One of the things that was most important to them was it had to be made very cheaply. So it wasn't bespoke environmental materials that would cost a fortune, because they felt if you had to generate lots of capital, then the capital that you needed for your mortgage or whatever would be produced in a way that would probably be environmentally destructive. So they saw this as a critique of capitalism, that it could be produced from bric-a-brac basically. So they made this very, very cheaply. They made it from materials that were readily at hand to them, and that was very important to them, that anybody would be able to go away and kind of replicate these things. The other thing was that they wanted people to be in control of the process, so they wanted people to be systems literate, in the sense, be aware of what it needed to sustain yourself. And they felt that that was a kind of hippie consciousness raising. Wasn't all about sort of sitting in a field and meditating. For them, it was about learning the process of making things and taking control through knowledge of the infrastructure of your own communities. Okay, I need to wind up here. So I will finish there. Shall we just have one more slide, please, Billy? So that's what the ecological house was about. And just to bring it, that's a lovely pen and ink drawing of the first ecological house, which was done in about 1971. So very, very early for those kind of developments that Graham Caine designed that one. You could have the next slide, and we'll finish off there. I just wanted to bring it back to Bristol a little bit, to the Bristol Gnomes. So this all happened. They were around sort of up until the mid-70s, and then they kind of dispersed as Street Farm didn't really exist as a collective after that point, and they did their own thing, but they still very much kind of kept involved with political activism and with the architecture movement. One thing that Bristol had and still has is Graham Caine ended up moving to Bristol, as did Peter Crump, and he started this thing called the Bristol Gnomes. So do you recognise these? Anybody recognise these buildings here?
Yeah.
Classic gnome work.
Yes.
So, yeah. So we've got so that's the Boiling Wells house that Graham Caine built, and also the St Werburgh City Farm. So he was the gnome behind this work. So brought it all back to Bristol. So there's a lot of this architecture of the Bristol Gnomes still around. There was a lovely bit of gnome work at the Barton Hill settlement, which unfortunately got knocked down in the time that I was doing this book, and we're not quite sure whether they found a home for it. It was just skipped, unfortunately. I think I'd probably better finish there. Actually, I've got more stuff that I could say, but
Well,
it's
okay,
all in the
thanks
book.
very much.
Yeah.
But, we'd like to take questions and contributions. We've got about a quarter of an hour, 10 minutes, quarter of an hour. Yeah.
I suppose an observation from the period was that I think a really strong part of the ethos then was, that you could do it yourself, that all the technology you could do it yourself, the buildings you could do it yourself. And I think there was a whole thing going on with slum clearance, where there was a lot of us who actually just took over old slums and reshaped them to do something more creative with the spaces that were there. You know, terraces of houses in the north of England, which is what I've experienced. But the whole idea that it was something that you could take over control of it, both as a social space, and I would emphasise that as much as, you know, anything to do with architecture or technology, but that you could recreate, you could create a new sort of social space that wasn't divided up, but you could be joined together much more.
Yeah, lovely example of that is that they were involved with a sort of political squatting movement in Camden and Kentish Town. At that time, that was a vast part of London. Victorian houses that were derelict, the council didn't want anybody to use them, and the council would go in, smash up the toilets, smash up the infrastructure. In one case, they pretty much demolished the house but left the front on it, and the local squatters, I think Street Farm were part of that, they went in and they put scaffolding up and they recreated a house within a house so that people could use that space again, which was great. And a whole infrastructure kind of built up around the city farms as well, which tied into that, which was nice.
One of the inspirations for that was the squatters that had gone in East London and had moved right out in the Blitz. That working class people, they couldn't live there because it was so dangerous in the bombings, and they moved out and squatted on the edges of London.
So there's a huge sort
in
of
the
post-war.
60s, the squatters who were squatting there knew about these people.
Yeah.
It's very striking how at the beginning the slides you had are so appropriate today to the situation we have today, where you're talking about the genesis of those ideas. What's been incubating for the last 30 years is now more needed than ever. One thing you didn't really talk about that I'd like to hear more about was the appropriate technology or side of the movement. This idea that it was very important that a technology that we could directly control ourselves undermined the capitalist infrastructure that was needed to support giant wind turbines or vast solar farms. And those ideas are absolutely key today, it seems.
Do you have any idea what the situation is now about environmental houses, the law, and are there some good examples within the last few years?
Well, I suppose probably the most innovative. Or shall I come back on the first?
Yeah.
I might ask you guys to talk about passive housing actually, because you're probably far more qualified to talk about that development. But yeah, I mean, there are some amazing developments going on, which I think should be getting a massive amount more support than they do. And I think, I'll get back to the other question first of all, shall I? And then you might want to talk about passive housing. But yeah, no, I think the control of technology was absolutely key. I mean, Murray Butcher talks about liberatory technology, and the thing that was important about them, I was talking about alienation, their measurement of whether something was revolutionary or not was whether it would be recuperated. So they were good situationists, and situationists, we have this problem, whatever we do in terms of rebellion, capitalism will always buy it and sell it back to us. Like I saw some posters up for alternative weddings the other day. So somebody, if you do your lovely local hand fasting and you organise that process yourself, somebody will say, well, that's a good idea, we could do that for you. And then they'll put a price on it and they'll sell it back to you. So that was going on all the time. So they're very, very keen not to be appropriated. So what street farmers thought was important would be to implement the sorts of changes like this that other people could take on, and that would set up a chain of transformation rather than being recuperated and packaged in again. I don't think we've ever got the answers to those questions, but there are some lovely books. I mean, in terms of alternative technology, there's a lovely book called Radical Technology, which I don't know whether you know that book, from 1976. Godfrey Boyle and Peter Harper, who were behind the Centre for Alternative Technology, put this compendium together. Every facet of life is covered in that book. The politics of why that change would be important, the possibilities around it. So the philosophy and the practical side were absolutely conjoined and linked together, which I think is really important. Why this stuff, well, I suppose what I've tried to think about is why this stuff is so important and relevant to us today. And I think those are the sorts of issues that do make them important. Okay. Did you want to talk about passive?
Yeah.
Did you want to get back on the first question about passive housing? Do you mind?
Were you going to talk about that or something different?
Something a bit different. Yeah.
Okay. Did you want to say something?
Passive. I'm an architect, so I am involved in what's, and it's much more now, I think, rather than the libertarian end, the self-help end of that is one-to-one place. And if you like, in the mainstream, there's a growing culture of trying to develop houses that have no energy signature whatsoever. In other words, the carbon footprint of them is zero. That's becoming, would you believe, public policy in 2016 through changes in government legislation. What a passive house is, and leaving aside all the technicalities, is it's trying to say that it shouldn't consume any energy other than what it produces, and it should, and this is, I think, an important part of that, people should be able to live in it cheaply. And I think, for instance, I've been involved in a scheme in Devon where the bills for people to live in, and I'm sure you all live in your own house, you know what your electricity and other bills are. The bills for people down there living in 3-bed houses are £260 a year, as opposed to the maybe £1,800 that those of you who live in old houses, wonderful old houses in Bristol, live in. So the idea is twofold, really, to develop a house that people can live in cheaply, but we've lost quite a lot of the house about people that can control their own housing circumstances, their own urban circumstances. I think that's the thing that's got lost. We've gone into the technology of materials and things. We've lost the idea that I was involved in a long time ago of people controlling the neighbourhoods and controlling how that neighbourhood is put together and how that neighbourhood changes and develops. Capitalism has won that bit quite easily, frankly, but they're losing a bit about technology and about people living in houses that are cheap to live in.
I think just to add to that is I was just interested in you might have seen quite a few news stories in the last week or two from Nick Clegg about building 3 new garden cities, and all the politics. I mean, that was a very political. There were a lot of politics and philosophy of control behind garden cities. All that is completely stripped out, and transpires there's no obligation to provide any affordable housing within those 3 garden cities, as I understand it. So. It's almost as if that name is kind of everybody likes gardens, so it's a very cuddly way of putting new town developments through. But all the politics and a lot of the environmental advantages may well be lost behind that.
Take you and then.
Yeah, I was just thinking about obviously having a house which is eco-friendly and whatever is pretty much not affordable these days for a lot of people that are really in need. For example, it tends to be like middle class people that can afford solar panels, double glazing and all the insulation and stuff like that. It's very much an area for an elitist few. When you compare now with your research to then, when you didn't have these technologies, do you feel that we've sort of steered away from making it accessible for people of the lower class? Because obviously then you didn't have to have solar panels.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I think as Bill was saying, I think that's been lost somewhere along the line. A lot of that politics, and people don't have that kind of control. That's kind of, it's as if I think someone sort of talked about the way that capitalism sort of takes the vehicle of change, strips it all away, and just keeps the bits it can repackage and sell. But all the kind of radical philosophy behind that has been lost somewhere along the line, and that's what needs to be reclaimed. I think.
If I might just point out or mention the impracticality of this kind of thing. When you think we're living in a very, very densely settled country, with very many people living in cities. So for every family to have a complete revolution in land use and ownership, because it would take an awful lot of space. So I'd like to say something in defence of those architects, the 650s, 60s, 70s, who are trying to design humane, high-density schemes for people to live in on the amount of land that they were allocated. And some of them are a lot better than others. Some of them being demolished and shouldn't be, and they're not going to be replaced by more public housing. They're going to be replaced by private developments. A good example is the original scheme King at Thamesmead, where you have a nice prime riverside site on the River Thames, and developers just love to get hold of that and
get at public housing tenants and sell it back to rich people. And this is what's happening all over. So a lot of these schemes are going, they're being demolished as we speak, and a lot of people are saying good riddance, and I'm not among them, I'm afraid. I think, you know, there are examples of better schemes and worse schemes. I think you really need to think hard about, you know, are you talking about a post-revolutionary situation where you can completely rehouse everyone in an ideal world, or are you talking about what you can do now? Because I think some of these architects did really rather well.
Yeah,
and you can add in more bells and whistles, green stuff, more community things. There's a fabulous Danish firm called Van Kunsten who did some brilliant schemes in the 80s and 90s. If anyone wants to go on Flickr, look at Zaire and Zaire, you'll see some pictures of some of those schemes. They're really brilliant low-rise schemes. They had internal streets, community space, space around them for growing veg, all this kind of stuff. And that takes more room than a tower block. It doesn't take an infinite amount of space to take quite a lot of people living in community together. And that's probably what you need to be thinking.
Yeah, I think I'm not against high density. I mean, I think you look at somewhere like Bath is very, very high density, but very high quality living. People want to live there, so it's more about the kind of control of that space, isn't it, and the underpinning of the social control.
For everyone to have something like that, you'd need an awful lot far that.
Okay, I'm really sorry, people are arriving for the next session, and I think we